everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Esther Arkansh, and I am an academic trainer with the Center for Teaching and Learning. Today's session is titled NCU Alumni Webinar, Can We Talk About It? How can we shift the disenfranchisement of grief with our very own NCU alumni, Shirley Shani Binsvi. Thank you for being here with us today. Just a reminder to everyone, I'm recording the webinar and the video will be posted on the CTL LibGuides page within 24 hours. If you have questions throughout today's session, you can use the Q&A or the chat features located at the bottom of the Zoom window. With that, I will turn it over to Shirley Shani Binsvi. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Esther. I am indeed Shirley Shani Binsvi. It's a Hebrew name, so no worries about pronouncing it. Nobody can. I'm going to talk about my favorite subject today, which is grief. Please feel free to stop me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to accommodate it. All right, so what is your best hope from attending this webinar today? This is my first question.
And if you all would like, you can drop those comments in the chat feature located at the bottom of your Zoom to answer that question. We do have some comments in the chat though at the moment. Right. Let's see, Honora, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, hopes to expand awareness of how to work with others experiencing disenfranchised grief. Let's see, Sydney says, I hope to learn more about discussions about grief, particularly with children, to inform my work at my local nonprofit as a bereavement counselor.
All right.
Let's see, professionally, Elizabeth is saying, professionally, I would like to learn about helping clients in therapy with grief. Personally, how to deal with my own losses in positive ways. Someone says, Paul says clarity. Okay, we're having a lot of comments.
All right. I can see it now, right now. This one is not necessarily just for therapists, but I will talk to you therapists as well. I am an MFT myself. But I'm going to start with some definition of what we're talking about today, assuming this will go. So first of all, thanatology. I often say I'm a thanatologist and people raise their eyebrows. It comes from the Greek word thanatos, the Greek god of nonviolent death, and it refers to the multidisciplinary study of death and dying, because we need to learn how to deal with that. And it is mainly done through ADEC, the Association of Death Education and Counseling here in the US. And that's where you get your certificate if anybody's interested in that. The other definition I want to pause of is grief, and there are plenty of those. You can find a definition of grief everywhere you look, starting with Freud, and he was talking about the work of grief and how to end it by releasing all connections to the person who is gone. I like this definition far better by Eleanor Haley from What's Your Grief? Grief is an ongoing and evolving experience involving cognitive, emotional, physical, and behavioral responses. So it is kind of an inclusive definition, which is why I like it. And it includes the secondary losses and stressors that are not what we see immediately when we talk about it. The other part of it is that grief is about our identity. It's not about what we lost or whom we lost. It's also about who we are when that connection is lost and no longer here, physically at least. All right, so now that we know what grief is, let's talk about disenfranchised grief. The term started with Kenneth Doka. Dr. Doka coined it in 1989. I was busy doing elementary school and he did this. And he said that every society had rules for who, when, where, how long, and for whom we grieve. And outside these rules, grief is not openly acknowledged, right? We can't talk about it outside. People don't recognize our grief. It's not socially validated. So society tells us we should not grieve, or it's not okay, or we shouldn't do it this way. It's not publicly observed. So we don't have symbols of our grief in that way. And he named 5 typologies of it, 5 aspects or ways in which grief will be disenfranchised. So this exclusion zone is when the relationship is not recognized. Society does not respect the relationship that there was. Such would be, for example, affairs outside the marriage. And in many societies, LGBTQ partnerships and marriages. When the loss itself is not acknowledged, that would be non-death loss often, or loss that people don't consider significant for one reason or the other. When the griever is excluded, people with disabilities, developmental disabilities, and children often are part of this. In the circumstances of death, suicide, homicide, overdose, and the ways in which individuals grieve. All these fall into the exclusion zone. Now, to be honest, I like to call this the excuse zone, because those are not really reasons, it's mainly excuses we give ourselves to why we don't recognize or respect someone's grief, or why society doesn't do it. Now, before I go into saying where it comes from and what the roots are, I will not like to emphasize this is not me trashing spirituality or religion or capitalism or modern science or any of those things. I'm saying everything has a side that we benefit from, and I'm talking about the side we benefit from less. So when it comes to belief systems, be it a religion or philosophy, most belief systems suggest a meaning to that. And if you see a meaning that's different or you grieve differently, then you may be disenfranchised. So I can tell you, as a Jewish woman, we have rules to who, how, and how long we mourn. And those are very specific. We mourn for parents, siblings, and children. So if I was very close with my grandmother, in those rules, I'm not part of the grieving system. I'm supposed to be part of the outside community. And we have those days, the first 3 days, the first 7 days named Shiva, the first 30 days, and then the year. And then we're supposedly done and only mention it once a year. And Christianity, the rules are not as implicit, and they're not as explicit, and they're not as written, but a lot of people talk about being happy because the person is with the Lord. And all of it is wonderful if it works for you. All of it is wonderful when it suits you and you're in the position to take benefit of it. But sometimes it's also a limitation. And then comfort, which can be found in these rules, can turn into a very limiting frame. And then there is the aspect of modern science. Again, I am extremely, extremely grateful to be living in an age when we have modern science. However, as Darcy Harris coined the term death-denying culture, Western culture is death-denying. We don't talk about it, we don't acknowledge it. In medicine, it's considered a failure rather than the normal, natural end of life. And then there is youth glorification. We are bombarded with how to look younger, function younger, be younger. There is that phrase, the world belongs to the youth, where in earlier times, older people were considered wise and knowledgeable and source of everything. So when we go with all that, eventually the fear of death, which is absolutely natural, and we all have it, myself included, it becomes fear of talking about the thing, talking about death. And in case someone missed the Harry Potter world in the last decade or so, this is Lord Voldemort. And in the series of books and movies, we can see nobody says his name, right? And it happens the same with death in our society, oftentimes. And of course, this also relates to illness and non-death losses. We hear people say someone died of an illness, and they don't say the name of the illness. It was so when a lot of people died from HIV and then cancer. We just don't say it. And we don't talk about non-death losses almost at all. And then there is the aspect of capitalism. I'm not a big fan of any other system. However, we do lose productivity, competition, and consumerism, which are all at the basis of capitalism, right? That's how we work. It works about through productivity and competition and consumerism. And when people grieve, they often consume less unless it's what they are targeted for. They care less about consuming, so there goes consumerism. They don't compete as much and they move away from the workforce for a little while. And then they're not as productive, their interests may change for a little while, so they don't fit into that capitalist mentality for just a while. And then oftentimes what happens is also it stays, the changes stay. And capitalism needs us to get up and get going and get everything moving again. So it goes against that. And of course, we therapists, we do wonderful, wonderful work, but our models, our older models, which are a lot more common still, give way to that too, because we have the 5 stages of grief by Kubler-Ross: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and you're done. And she did not mean that, actually. She said numerous times, she didn't mean it to be in this order. Not everybody has to go through all that and all the things. But eventually, when you put it in a 5-stage model, people expect all these 5 to happen in this order and then acceptance, and you're done. And then there are the tasks of mourning that were supposed to suggest a different structure that would solve that. They call it tasks, so it's not supposed to be in an order. That to acknowledge the loss, process the loss, adjust to the loss, find an enduring connection, which we'll talk about a little later. We call it differently now. And what happened is the same. People somehow saw it as like a linear process and we're done. And it creates these expectations. First, when it regards to the process, we think in linearity, because no matter how many times they'll tell us stages are not linear, we think linear, right? And the process itself is spiral. You go up some, you go down some, you go up again, and sideways too. So it's not a linear process. We expect some timeline of an order to things and when it will happen, and there is no timeline. I deliberately chose this Dali iconic liquid watch because there is really no timeline to grief. And we expect recovery to be the end of the process. But in fact, we use resilience to integrate the loss into who we are now. So there is no end to it. It just differs over time and becomes part of who we are. And the other is their expectation of appropriatism. I added the ism deliberately because it's not a real thing. The who and what grieve and what we do when we grieve, when what actually appropriate to do is go by the meaning of our losses, what they meant to us and what who we are now mean. And then there is the how we grieve. Right? If you do this, you're doing it right. If you do that, you're doing it wrong. Actually, it's whatever right for us, as long as we don't hurt ourselves or anybody else. And there is the expectation for people's responses. I should know what to say to my best friend. I should know what to do. And normally we don't. And my suggestion is to be. And it's very, very hard for us because we want to do. But oftentimes we just need to be. So I'm going to break for a short video, and I want you to pay attention. And after that, I'm going to ask you something. So this is from the first pilot episode of Golden Girls many, many years ago.
Just checking. You never know. Tell me, how is Blanche?
She didn't go to work again today.
Oh.
It's been 3 weeks and she just sits in her room. The museum's gonna fire her.
Well, we've tried everything. Golf, the movies, theater tickets. She wouldn't even budge for Julio Iglesias.
I know grief.
Oh.
It takes time.
Please, Rose. Listen, if you're Irish, you have a wake. You eat, you cry, you drink, you vomit, and you're done. If you're Jewish, you cry, you sit, you eat for 7 days, you put on 10 pounds, and it's over. We Italians scream, dress up a donkey, hire a band, and that's that. It's these Southern Protestants who make it a way of life.
When I go, put me in a steel sack and leave me on the curb next to the cans.
We thought you were asleep.
You never know.
So first, I want to say I can only testify that for Jewish people, she's absolutely right. But also, what did you notice in this video when she went over that grief? Esther, I love that video too.
Very cute. We have Kate in the comments saying discounting of culture.
Yes. What else?
Elizabeth is saying there's a specific order of activities people engage in.
Yes. So Dorothy is focused on time, limited, right, and concise. She should be over it right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Dorothy is saying she's doing it wrong and too long. And in this pilot, they're not letting her be. That is correct, Paul. And in this pilot, I will say Blanche, the woman they're talking about, was dumped at the altar, which is not a fun experience. And it is a grief to go through, but they won't give her the time. They have rules that they go over. And Dorothy names all the rules, right? So if we go back to these 5 typologies, the relationship is not recognized and the loss is not acknowledged. The griever is excluded, circumstances of death, and ways individuals grieve. I would challenge you to think about one case that doesn't fall within these rules, one way or the other. And I will not give you a long time for this challenge because I've been asking myself that question for many, many years. And in one way or the other, all grief fall here. Everything. I can give you an excuse why to disenfranchise every single case. And that is our problem that we're talking about today. And so let's talk about the added bonus, as I use sarcasm when I say it, social justice, because this as a whole is a social justice problem. Everybody will grieve at some point and will be marginalized for it. But if you're also part of a minority or marginalized group, then when you grieve, those two words are very similar, you also have to deal with suffocated grief, which is where the expression of your grief is not only disenfranchised, but it is punished. Society will punish you for it. It happens to marginalized group, minority groups. They have their grief suffocated and disenfranchised through extra stress, extra pain, extra grief on that. They have less access to resources to support them. Often because it is so suffocated, they can't go anywhere and express it. And therefore, they also suffer more secondary losses. So in cases of financial losses, I had a family, my first ever clients, who lost their home, their income, and they had hospitals dismiss them before the loss. All those are secondary losses, which are major on top of a death. And that would not have happened had they not been part of a marginalized group. They're often stereotyped. as minorities. These are people of color would be stereotyped. Women are stereotyped in general. LGBTQ people are stereotyped. I'm not saying it right. LGBTQ plus people are stereotyped, and they're discriminated against. And that is to top their grief. So they're in grief, and then they also have to deal with that. And the resulted experience is, first of all, self-doubt. The question that we hear a lot in the therapy room is, am I doing this right? And the answer is probably yes, if you're not hurting yourself or others. But people doubt themselves. It becomes a single identity. So when you go about your life after a loss, all people see is that grief. And I've been there a few times myself. I am still Shirley in those moments, but to the other people outside myself, I am that grieving person and nothing more. And then they don't know what to do with me. They don't know what to say to me. Also, the awkwardness come in. Even in the best of relationships, people naturally, they don't know what to say because they don't think they're talking to you anymore. They think you're talking to your grief. And then with that awkwardness, when people don't know what to say, they often say nothing. And in comes isolation and that feeling of abandonment, which again, people don't necessarily mean. I'm sure they don't, but it does happen and it is the experience. And of course, you feel marginalized because people don't approach, don't talk. When a person in grief comes into a crowd, often people will step away or look the other way because they don't know what to do. And they are too afraid they'll do something wrong. They're not doing anything at all. And there is the pathologizing of grief. And so we talk about it as an illness, as a problem. And so as I say that, I would like to add this really new elephant in the room of diagnosis. Recently, we had a prolonged grief disorder entered into the new edition of the DSM. And it's been long coming. They've been fighting for it for a very long time. And it caused a lot of talk and discussions and somewhat of a storm in the thanatology world. The intent is to make sure that people who need help receive help. It was never to pathologize grief, but sometimes people do need help and they can't get it if it doesn't have a code by it, oftentimes. And so in my opinion, and a lot of other people that I look to agree with that, the focus should never be on a timeline, right? The DSM has the 6-month timeline and the year timeline, and it should never be on that. It should be on the interruption of everyday life. How much does this grief interferes with a person's activities of daily living, with what they can and cannot do or feel they can and cannot do, how they can endure continuing bonds, make meaning, all those things that help them, rather than, oh, you're grieving a year and a day. And it's not about just the symptoms or just the time mark. It's about that interruption and how debilitating the symptoms are. So if someone kept a t-shirt of a person who has passed away, in and of itself should not be a problem, even if it's been 2 years. If they kept a room that now they can't go into and now they have mold in the house, or someone else needs that room, or they're supposed to be moving out and they can't. So now it's interrupting with their everyday life. And now we can talk about prolonged grief disorder. So don't look at the time mark. Look at how debilitating symptoms are. All right, so now that I talked about all the things that are going on that makes us maybe have a hard time dealing with it, what can we do about it, right? Because you didn't come here to hear me talk about the bad stuff. You want me to tell you what I think we can do about it, and maybe hear from you if you help me figure out what we can do about it. So on our own first, let's reflect on our own relationship with grief. Esther, if you're here, do you probably have something to say?
I thought you were going into questions.
Not yet, not yet, not yet. So the first is reflect on your relationship with grief, what you were taught about it. How was it modeled to you? How did you see others grieve? Your parents, your siblings, your community members, your elders, how did you see them grieve? And then, of course, as you grew up, how do you grieve? What is your relationship with grief? It changes over time. It changes over our life. So don't do this just once. Doesn't have to be every day, but periodically ask yourself this question, because it will guide you as you go on to deal with others. Then I ask you to trust young people. And by trust young people, I mean trust children. Children can handle grief. We don't have to hide it from them. And if you notice Disney movies, as a mother, it really bothers me that in Disney movies, parents die all the time. But I never tried to hide it from my kids or call it a different name. But if you watch the movies, the parents disappear. We don't really touch upon that well. Frozen 2 did a little better job around that, maybe. And then we want to educate others, talk to each other, talk to other people, and set up to social messages about get on with it. And we want to encourage conversation. It is an acceptable talk. It is an acceptable conversation. You know that term, not at the dinner table? Yes, at the dinner table. I'm not saying have dinner today. When you go tonight to have dinner with your family, say, hey, let's talk about that. That will be fun. But I am saying, when it comes up, don't look the other way. Talk about it. And then when we meet people in grief, I want to pause and acknowledge this picture. It came to me at a time that I was supporting someone, and it shows a dolphin carrying her cub, and her group, her community comes to support her as she gets tired to carry him. And as a community, as friends, as people, we need to show up. We tend to look away, but we actually need to show up. Initiate the connection, reach out to people in whatever way you can. So if you can show up, make sure you schedule a meeting. Don't just show up at someone's doorstep unless it's appropriate. But if you can show up physically, call, phone call, email if you need to. Make sure you show up. You tell them you're there. And then keep showing up. It's not a one-time thing. Do it again, periodically. Appropriate to the connection that you have. Make sure you check in. If you happen to be in groups or in a public setting, approach that person and be with them like you used to do, like you would have done before the loss, because others will look away. Don't do it in pity. Do it like you've done it always. And then remember to see them for who they are, right? They're not just their grief now, even though it is very present often. They're also that same person who has that same relationship with you, who has probably still their sense of humor, who had those other experiences in life. All the whole is still there. And I can tell you from my own experience, I have a very, very dark sense of humor. And in times of grief, I needed permission from my friends to use it, not explicitly, but I needed to be able to make a joke and see someone smile and not be appalled from the very fact that I just made a joke and I'm supposed to be grieving. So just remember, they're still them. I was still Shirley behind all that. And I hear it a lot from people. You read it in the literature. People say, they don't see me anymore. They only see my grief. I feel like I'm contagious. And then be specific in the support you offer. What I'm saying here is saying, and I fall in this trap all the time myself, right? Whatever you need, give me a call. But I put them in a place where wherever you need, now they need to think about what they need and what they feel they can ask me for. And maybe it's something I can't actually do. So be more specific in what you can do. Can I help you deliver the message? Can I babysit your kids? Can I make a meal? Can I start a meal train? Can I do this? And whatever it is that you can actually do, offer that. And then support their meaning finding. Finding meaning is a process, and they need to go through it. And when we talk about finding meaning, we talk about meaning for the relationship and for the loss, if possible. The loss sometimes doesn't have one, but the life does, and the relationship does. And whatever meaning they put into it, if that's what they need there, then support it. Don't try to correct it. Don't try to fix it. It's theirs to find and create. Encourage continuing bonds. Continuing bonds is that sense that we still have that inner representation of the relationship inside us, regardless of physical presence. So we need to encourage that in the way that we find beneficial, they find beneficial, and not try to get them to separate. A continuing bond is a huge source of support when we can still hear that person supporting us like they did before. In the therapy room, it's a little different because sometimes that voice is not supportive and we have to work on that. But in everyday life, if the continuing bond is beneficial, we want to encourage that. And we do it by talking about that person and mentioning their names and reminiscing together and allowing it to be there. Not if someone mentions the name, we all look away and look for something else to talk about. And I ask you to watch your language. So no buts and no at leasts and all these, because these minimize or erase everything in front of them. I agree with you, but I don't agree with you. At least means whatever loss you suffer, at least it's not worse. That is not necessarily helpful. And it minimizes their experience. Yes, Esther, I see you there.
Yeah, we have a question in the Q&A.
All right.
Crystal's asking, does prolonged grief disorder have to be classified as grief related to death, or is it worded as a loss to incorporate other disenfranchised losses?
Currently, it's related to death. I can't predict what the future will hold. I'm hoping it will expand. No cliches. So there are a lot of cliches around grief. In Hebrew, there is one that says, may you know no more sorrow, which is impossible because I'm going to take the next breath and my sorrow is still there. Cliches are rarely helpful, so just drop those. No comparisons, right? That one lost more than you, so you should be good. It doesn't work that way. Ours is the worst, always. No fact checking, scaling, or correcting. I am all for fact checking in any other context. But when it comes to someone's grief, I'm not going to check if the loss happened on Thursday, on a Wednesday, and if it was this reason or that reason. I'm just going to be with them. Leave your faith out. Whatever your faith is, it is helpful for you, not necessarily for someone else. So if someone tells me everything happens for a reason and I don't believe that, then you're not helping me. And if anything, it hurts me because I'm supposed to have a reason and be okay, but I don't. Please don't frame a loss as a gift. And again, if someone does it for themselves, then by all means, I'll support it. Who am I to tell them it wasn't a gift? But also, who am I to tell them it was? We don't offer solutions because whatever solution I came up with, it's only good for me. And also, oftentimes, there is no solution. It's a process. We'll go through it. There is no time frame or a stage. So, oh, I can hear you're in the anger stage now. Actually means, well, you're going to be done being angry and move to the next stage. And that's not helpful. Don't time frame everybody. It's been 3 days, like in that video that we saw. It's their own timeline. This is a hard one because sometimes when people tell us about a loss, we get overwhelmed for a minute and then they console us. I'm asking us all to try our best to not let the grievers console us because that's not their job. Will it happen? Probably, because we get the shock. But if we can hold it together and take our pain away from there to someone in a larger circle, that would be an outside circle, that would be helpful. And let's try to not hijack someone's grief, meaning we try not to, one up them. You think you had it bad, I had it worse, right? Or let's talk about mine. And all these are things that we do to find comfort for ourselves. So let's leave our comfort out of this. This is all about the grievers. Instead, above all, acknowledge the pain. And I actually like this cartoon, right? What I think you have is an attitude problem. Try to think of it the positive way. I'm dying slowly. Think of it as living quickly, right? We try to do this. This is not acknowledging the pain. Let's try to, above all, acknowledge the pain. It's actually the title of one of the articles you'll find in the resource list I'll send after. And it means don't try to fix it. And listen and validate their stories, whatever meaning they find, right? It's a very important process to reconstruct meaning to loss. And so we need to let it happen their way and their feelings. And this nice lady is saying everything about minimizing grief. And if you happen to be a therapist, I would ask you to also, what's your psychoeducation? Meaning don't tell people where they are in the process, what they should be going through and all that. Be with them instead of trying to teach them how to do it right. And then use more of the modern grief theories. And there is meaning finding or meaning reconstruction. There is continuing bonds, which is based well within attachment theory. If you do more of these and less of the stages, you are supporting them in their process rather than trying to put them in the little box of the process that we were taught once. All right, so what about the children? We need to pay attention to developmental stage, of course. Talk in a language that they understand in a way that they understand. Very young children, they think concretely. So we need to say that we'll never meet that person again. We won't be able to touch them, speak with them, see them, hear them, all these very concrete actions. They don't always understand the linearity of time. So often they'll say, okay, but when they come back, and so we need to be able to be with that and remind and explain again until that linearity sinks in. They don't always understand the finality of that, right? My own daughter came up with this beautiful, beautiful description of where dead people live. And she constantly told me about how she visited there and she talked to the people we lost, which was beautiful and went away with age. And they may have some magical thinking. So the same daughter also suggested to build a machine for us to go visit the people we lost and we miss. And she promised me she'll do it when she grows up. Of course, as she grew up, she realized that it's final and she can't make this happen. And she stopped wanting to. The other part of magical thinking is that they will often think it's because of them. And we need to be really mindful about that, listening to what they say to us, because sometimes they think, well, if I was mad at that person and then this happened and they died and they went away, right? So we need to be very careful. They can process it very well at a young age because taboos, all these taboos we talked about at the beginning, they don't have them yet in their minds. So if we let them understand it in their language, in the way that they process it extremely well. We want to have an attachment figure that is a caregiver they rely on, they trust to break the news. And they are extremely aware of parents and caregivers' moods. So if we are sad, don't try and hide it. They'll pick it up, and it's even more anxiety provoking if they don't know why you are in that mood. Right? I'm not saying break down and cry on their shoulders, have them console you, but be open. What else we can do with them? Answer questions. Their questions will guide you to what they can and want to know. And they will be appropriate to what they can and want to know. So just go along, answer. Answer truthfully, stay with your truth. If you believe in something, by all means, use it. If you don't make something up just to sound nicer to them, because as they grow up, they will realize you did not tell them the truth. And then what you thought would be protection might, I'm not saying it necessarily will, but it might become deception. Use explicit language. A death is a death. Cancer is cancer, right? Use words they can understand and explicit, because if we say they went to sleep for a very long time, we might find a kid that is afraid to go to sleep. If we say they died of an illness, then next time someone has a sore throat, that might be a problem. Model and encourage emotional expression and regulation. So yes, express your sorrow, express your grief, express your missing someone, all of those, and show it in a way that tells them it is also, you can do it and stay together and be alive after it. You won't fall apart. You won't break into pieces that you cannot put together. Encourage them to express in writing, if they write already, absolutely. It can be a journal, it can be letters, it can be a memory book, anything they want, stories about that person, anything that works for them. Drawing or a combination of drawing and writing, that person or a story or whatever comes to mind. Sometimes it's just, the colors of the feelings. Role play. We adults can have a conversation in our head with someone, but for kids, it's a bit harder. And sometimes they want to either role play the way they were told or the last encounter or what they would say to that person. And if they want to, let's role play with them. Again, don't force it if they want to. Remembrance talk. It means talk about that person in a way that keeps them there for that kid, for the children, and do it in a way that's positive and supports continuing bonds that are supporting them. I can tell you again, from clients' experiences, these help a lot, and my own personal experience, my children did not know my parents, and yet they know my parents very, very well. In schools, we want to have bereavement lists so that teachers will know which kid is in grief and can be considerate of that. We need safe havens. These are places where kids can go and be and express their feelings and express their grief, no questions asked. We need trusted adults that the children can approach and talk to. This can be the school nurse or the counselor. If the loss is within the class or school, class discussions, group discussions, play groups to process all that are highly recommended. If the loss is within the school, a memorial wall can be helpful for them to put up pictures, notes, something to help them process again in a group, together. Planting flowers can also be very helpful for them in memory of the people they lost. Last but not least, in our communities, the bigger communities, we want to reach out and teach. And we want to reach out to grieving people, create programs and workshops to talk about grief and bereavement. I personally ask you to encourage conversation in a larger circle, in the community that you belong to, whatever that might be, a club, a synagogue, a church, a mosque. Educate, talk to people about how we need to talk about grief, right? How we should not look the other way. And remind them, by the way, that it's the only part of our lives that is guaranteed. I cannot guarantee anything, but I can guarantee everybody will grieve at some point. And then advocate and stand up to this social message. We all know somebody who knows somebody. And if we can get to a point when we don't expect people to be over it in 3 days, that would be lovely. And so for now, I will thank you. This is my phone number at the office and my email. And you can always send me questions, give me a call. I will happily speak with you. Let me stop sharing and see questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I personally myself I'm dealing with a type of grief right now, and I'm grateful for being here and that you're sharing this information, because it is kind of like putting things into perspective. And I think a lot of people, even in the chat right now, are kind of discussing their griefs. So I do have something in the Q&A, and then I don't know if you want to also talk about what's going on in the chat. I think the Q&A.
I'm taking a look right now. Yeah, I'm taking a look right now. Yes.
Okay. The Q&A is tied to the conversations in the chat. So I'm going to bring up the question in the Q&A. Serena says, my type of grief is unique as other women with breast cancer.
Serena, I completely agree with you. Mm-hmm. You're grieving, you lost a part of yourself, and people don't acknowledge that. And it's okay to be more blunt about it. If you, not that you need my permission, but I'm suggesting to be a little more, to be open about it, by all means.
I think her question in Q&A is, why is there such a lack of understanding of grief in women with breast cancer?
Why is a big word. I can venture a few guesses. One is it's very scary, right? We're afraid. Your cancer put people face to face with their own mortality and their own risk of getting cancer and needing to do what you've done and having a mastectomy or a double mastectomy. And it's easier to just look away, right? It's just easier. It's also socially acceptable, that ease, that looking away. And there is that at least that I mentioned before, where at least you're alive, right? You probably heard that horrible line more than once. Not that it's not true. I'm happy that you're alive. Not knowing you, I'm very happy that you're alive, but it doesn't mean you have not lost. But people need to hang on to that, because that's what society has taught us to do. That's my best educated guess. Does that make any sense to you, Serena?
I see something in the chat. Oh, we have Sydney. Okay, if there other additional conversations are being added. Do you want me to go through the?
I'm reading it as well, but any questions there?
Okay, no questions, but I do want to Let's see, Crystal is saying, I've been working with clients experiencing grief from having COVID losses and of friendships losses related to sexual trauma. I try to make spaces for these types of grief because society does not.
Yes, thank you. The more space, the better. Sydney, I read that comment about a woman who lost her child. I had a stillbirth as my first and a miscarriage as my second. And I've had people tell me, and then I had twins. I still have the twins, knock on wood. They're 11. And I will tell you, I've had people tell me, well, you lost two, you gained two. And people just don't get it. They don't. They need to make sense to themselves with numbers and God needing angels and all that. And with all due respect to God needing angels and their belief, they should not have said it to them.
We did have something else in the Q&A. When a friend is not understanding why you are grieving and shames you for continuing to grieve, would you recommend continuing to try to get this person to understand or move away from this friendship? Any other suggestions?
That depends on the friendships, of course. If it's someone that's very important to you, then do your best to keep the friendship and be very open about what their behavior means to you, that you feel shamed, that you feel blamed, that you feel they're not being a supportive friend. If that person is not close enough to do all that, then ask yourself that question that you just asked me, is it still worth it? But I'm not saying throw away people. I'm saying ask yourself what you need. It's all about what you need when you're grieving. And we can always, step away and come back.
Sure. So we do have maybe a few more minutes within the webinar. So this is the time to ask questions. I think something else popped
Sydney,
up. You got it?
my thought is, if it is beneficial and helpful, I am all for it, regardless of any way that we continue the bond and it's helpful for us, I am all for it. If it is helpful for your client or your friend or you, then by all means, yes. If it is not helpful, seek help to make it helpful. That depends on the attachment. Then the connection might look the same as it looked before in many ways. So if I had someone who was a secure attachment figure for me, was a supportive figure for me, then I will continue to hear their support in my heart and in my mind. And if not, then I will seek help to change that and talk about whatever benefited me in that relationship, because I kept it for a reason, right? So it would look a lot like the earlier bond, the live bond, the living bond, just without the living presence.
We have a question in the Q&A. Paul says, what if your support system is gone and professional support can feel so isolated? Any advice?
When you find the right professional support, it will be supportive of you. And if your whole support system is gone, I highly recommend finding the right professional support. Try to not go through it alone. And again, if your whole system is gone, I am so, so sorry.
Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions at the moment. I think now would be a good time to, should I answer this? We'll take this one last question. Well, this will be the last question, and we'll wrap up the Q&A here. Crystal says, how do you help clients create boundaries around their grief? For example, a client that wants time alone, but also wants to make others happy by including them in her grief process.
That goes to creating boundaries in general, right? She probably has boundary issues outside her grief. I would encourage her to find a both end, how she can include people and save some time for herself as well. Do both.
All right. Well, that will conclude our Q&A session. Shirley, would you mind putting your information in the chat? I'll probably end up, the presentation, I will forward this to you all, for at least the attendees and registrants for this webinar. You will be getting an email with this, but in the chat, if you could possibly just put your a way that people can reach you so you all have access to it. We want to thank you very much for taking the time out and presenting to us today and sharing this amazing information. I'm sure it'll be helpful for a lot of people, and a lot as our attendees are thanking you very much for the information. It seemed like this conversation was much needed and helpful for a lot of people.
Thank you all for taking the time.
No problem. So just a friendly reminder to everyone, we want to thank Shirley for taking the time to present, and thank the attendees for joining as well. As a reminder, the recording will be posted on the CTL LibGuides page within 24 hours, as well as our YouTube page. So you all can always revisit this presentation if needed. Thank you all again for attending, and I would like to conclude this webinar. Again, thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.